Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 110. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter. And each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 110, the top 3 issues are the text of verse 3, an issue having to do with Melchizedek in verse 4, and the subject or subjects in verses 5 to 7, and the question of who drinks from the wadi. The first issue is the text of verse 3. Verse 3 is, as the footnote of one Bible translation puts it, one of the most difficult texts in all the Bible. Many translations have similar footnotes indicating that the interpretation of the Hebrew text is uncertain or difficult to understand. To illustrate the difficulty and the variety of ways in which translators have responded to the difficulty, consider, for example, 2 modern English translations. The NIV translates the verse as, "Your troops will be willing on your day of battle. Arrayed in holy splendor, your young men will come to you like dew from the morning's womb." This translation is accompanied by a footnote saying that the meaning of the Hebrew for this sentence is uncertain. Contrasts the NIV with the NEB, which says, "At birth you were endowed with princely gifts and resplendent in holiness. You have shone with the dew of youth since your mother bore you." This translation is accompanied by 3 footnotes which give alternate renderings and note that the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. Where the NIV has "on your day of battle," the NEB has "at birth." Where the NIV has "your troops will be willing," the NEB has "you were endowed with princely gifts." And where the NIV as a whole seems to be describing the gathering of the king's army, the NEB seems to be describing the qualities of the king himself. And these are just some of the differences for the sake of illustration. When we compare other modern translations, the possibilities are multiplied and it becomes difficult to get a handle on what's going on in this verse and where to begin. In this video, we will not be able to look at all of the different interpretations of this verse and the reasons behind them. We will, however, try to isolate one at a time those points in the interpretation of this verse which seem most foundational. A comparison among modern translations reveals 3 major points of difference, all of which have to do with the text that is to be translated. The first 2 of these issues are concerned with the vocalization of the consonantal Hebrew text, and the last of these issues is concerned with the consonantal text itself. The first point of difference in this verse is the vocalization of the first 2 words in the psalm. The Masoretic text reads, "Amcha nedavot," which means something like, "your people are or will be willing." And most modern translations follow this vocalization. Some modern translations, however, following the Septuagint, have vocalized the text differently, "Imcha nedivut," which results in a translation like, "with you is royal dignity." How can we decide which vocalization is more likely? Both vocalizations have ancient support among the ancient versions. Both are syntactically viable, and so we have to turn to other lines of argumentation. One argument for the vocalization of the Masoretic text is based on the poem in Judges 5. Judges 5 celebrates, among other things, the willingness of the people who volunteered for battle. Verse 2 says, "when the people willingly offer themselves," and the language here is very similar to what we find in the Masoretic text of Psalm 110:3. Behitnadev am. The collocation of the word am and the root nadav in Judges 5 might support seeing something similar here in Psalm 110:3. This interpretation would also fit well in the context of Psalm 110. The previous verse has mentioned extending the king's dominion, which implies military conquest, which in turn implies the presence of an army. The promise of extended dominion in verse 2 is thus followed by the promise in verse 3 of an army, one that is willing and eager to fight. Furthermore, the word translated power in verse 3 has military overtones, and it often refers to an army. And so for these reasons, it's likely that the text should be vocalized, "Amcha nedavot," your people will be willing. Another problem in verse 3 regarding the vocalization of the text comes at the very end of the verse. The Masoretic text reads Yaldutecha, which means your youth, or perhaps in light of the mention of a willing army earlier in the verse, your young men, your young fighting men. Most modern translations follow the Masoretic text here. A few translations, however, again following the Septuagint, say, instead of youth or young men, I have begotten you. These translations are vocalizing the form as a verb with a pronominal suffix, yelidticha. There are strong arguments for both of these vocalizations. The vocalization yelidticha, I have begotten you, has ancient roots. This is how the Septuagint vocalized the text. Furthermore, the consonantal text itself suggests this vocalization. Notice the yod between the final two consonants, which is exactly what we would expect if the word was pronounced yelidticha. And the yod is more difficult to explain if the word were pronounced yaldutecha. The absence of any vav between the dalet and tav also supports the vocalization yelidticha. If it were yaldutecha, then we might expect a vav, yaldutecha. As it is, the consonantal text suggests yelidticha. The problem with this view is that yelidticha, I have begotten you, does not fit very well in the immediate syntactic context. The two previous words are lecha tal, yours is the dew, or the dew will come to you, or something like that. And if we read yelidticha, I've begotten you, it's not at all clear what to do with lecha tal. In fact, the Septuagint, which reads, I have begotten you, omits these two words lecha tal entirely, perhaps because the translator could not make sense of them. If, however, we read yaldutecha with the Masoretic text, then it's possible to understand tal yaldutecha as a construct chain, the dew of your youth, or as we've translated it, the dew of your young men, the dew that is your young men. And so syntactically, the vocalization yaldutecha, youth or young men, makes more sense. But how do we account for the odd spelling? In particular, how do we explain the yod near the end of the word? Well, it could be that the yod is present because yaldutecha is a pausal form. It's yaldutecha and not yaldutcha. In Ecclesiastes 11:9, for example, we find the same phenomenon happening on the very same word, b'yaldutecha, which, like the form in Psalm 110:3, is in pause and has a yod. As for the absence of a vav, this can be explained as an example of defective spelling, something that we see happening often in the Hebrew Bible. For example, the morphologically similar word galut is usually spelled with a vav, but it also occurs, for example, in Obadiah, without a vav. So while the spelling of yaldutecha is admittedly odd, it is possible to explain. And it's easier to explain the spelling of yaldutecha than to explain the syntactic function of lecha tal if we adopt the alternative vocalization yelidticha. And so for these reasons, we've followed the Masoretic text in reading the text as yaldutecha, your young men. The third basic textual issue in this verse doesn't just involve alternate vocalizations of the consonantal text, but actually slightly different consonantal texts. The Masoretic text reads, in the second line of verse 3, Bahadre Kodesh. Most modern translations follow this reading, and they interpret it to mean something like garments of holiness, or holy garments. A significant minority of modern translations, however, say, instead of holy garments, holy mountains. The difference between garments and mountains is a single letter. Bahadre Kodesh versus Baharre Kodesh. The Dalet and the Resh look very similar, and so the confusion is understandable. The question is, did the Dalet become a Resh, or did the Resh become a Dalet? Which one is original, and which one is secondary? The Masoretic text reading Bahadre Kodesh, holy garments, is supported by the earliest textual witnesses. The Septuagint, for example, appears to have read Bahadre Kodesh. 3 of the Greek revisers, along with the Peshitta and the Targum, also appear to have read Bahadre Kodesh. The reading Bahadre Kodesh, Holy Mountains, is by contrast less well supported, though there is some support for it. A significant minority of medieval Hebrew manuscripts read Bahadre Kodesh, and we see this reading also reflected in the ancient translations of Symmachus and Jerome. Now, if we just look at this manuscript evidence alone, we might be inclined to prefer the reading Bahadre Kodesh, which is better attested. But the reading Bahadre Kodesh isn't without its problems. In the first place, there's no other example of this phrase in biblical Hebrew. There's a similar phrase, Hadrat Kodesh, which occurs several times and refers to holy garments, but it's always Hadrat Kodesh and not Hadre Kodesh. If Psalm 110:3 were referring to holy garments, we might have expected Hadrat Kodesh. Furthermore, the plural Hadre is in and of itself odd. The noun Hadar occurs 28 times in the Bible as a singular noun. This would be the only example of the noun in the plural. Now, the anomalous nature of this phrase doesn't mean that Bahadre Kodesh is not the original reading. There are plenty of anomalies in the Hebrew Bible. But it does call this reading into question. The reading Bahadre Kodesh, by contrast, presents no real difficulties. The same exact phrase occurs in Psalm 87:1, where it refers to the mountains around Zion. In Psalm 110, the previous verse, verse 2, has mentioned Zion. So a reference to Zion's holy mountains in verse 3 would be fitting in the context. Another way in which mountains fits well in the context is the mention of dew in verse 3. Whether we choose Bahadre Kodesh or Bahadre Kodesh, the prepositional phrase is probably modifying the word dew. And it makes sense to describe dew as coming on the holy mountains. Psalm 133, for example, presents the image of dew coming down on the mountains of Zion, Harare Zion. The reading Hadre Kodesh, holy garments, also fits the context, though. The following verse describes the king as a priest. It's only appropriate then that his army in verse 3 should be an army of priests, dressed in holy garments. So how do we decide between these two readings, both of which make sense in the context of the psalm? Although a decision is difficult, it seems likely that Bahadre Kodesh, mountains, holy mountains, is original. It just fits too well in the context to be secondary. By contrast, the reading Bahadre Kodesh is anomalous morphologically, and it sticks out a little more in the context. It pops more. It can be made to fit, but not as easily. Now, obviously, it's a rule of textual criticism that very often the easier reading is secondary, because scribes were more likely to make a text easier than to make it harder to read. The fact that Bahadre Kodesh is the more difficult reading, along with the fact that it's a better attested reading, is a powerful argument in its favor. But it's also true that a scribal error, by definition, results in a more difficult reading, and Bahadre Kodesh is easily explained as a scribal error. At some early point in the transmission of the text, a scribe, perhaps he was thinking of the phrase Bahadrat Kodesh, mistook the resh for a dalet, and produced a more difficult reading. To wrap up this first issue then, we've translated verse 3 as, "Your people will be willing on the day you manifest your power. On holy mountains from the womb of dawn, the dew, your young men, will come into your possession." If asked to rate the level of confidence we have in our interpretation of this verse on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a C rating. The next issue for Psalm 110 meets us in the next verse. Verse 4 says, "The Lord has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are forever a priest, just like Melchizedek." The issue in this verse is in the last line, just like Melchizedek. To illustrate the problem involved in interpreting this line, let's look at the NRSV translation. The NRSV translates this line as, "according to the order of Melchizedek." This translation is fairly similar to our translation. Both mention Melchizedek, both indicate that there's some kind of comparison between Melchizedek and the king in Psalm 110. The NRSV, however, also has a footnote with an alternative translation. Or, they say, "forever a rightful king by my edict." These two very different translations of this line are translations of the very same Hebrew text. The text reads, Al divrati Melchizedek. Unlike in the previous verse, there's no textual issue here. The issue instead has to do with grammar and semantics. What do these words mean, and how do they fit together in the sentence? The NRSV translates Al divrati as according to the order of, and it translates, or rather transliterates, Melchizedek as Melchizedek. The NRSV footnote, however, translates Al divrati as by my edict, and it translates Melchizedek as a rightful king. So there are two problems in this verse. One has to do with the interpretation of Al divrati. Is it according to the order of, or by my edict, or something else? And the other has to do with the interpretation of Melchizedek. Is it a proper noun, Melchizedek, or is it a combination of common nouns that means a rightful king? We'll look at these issues one at a time, first looking at the issue of Melchizedek. The vast majority of translations agree that Melchizedek is a proper noun, that is, a name or a title, Melchizedek. As we've seen from the NRSV footnote, however, it's possible to read Melchizedek as a construct chain consisting of two common nouns, Malchi plus Tzedek, and meaning something like king of righteousness or rightful king. This interpretation is also reflected in the JPS 85 translation and in the Aramaic Targum. Some who argue for this view note that Melchizedek is written as two words. There's a space between Malchi and Tzedek. By contrast, compound names in the Bible are usually represented in writing as a single word. For example, Avimelech in the superscription of Psalm 34 is written as one word, not two words. Therefore, the argument goes, Melchizedek, which is written as two words, is probably not a proper noun, a name, but rather a combination of common nouns. But this argument is not convincing. There are numerous examples of names in the Bible which are written as two words, and it will suffice here to cite only one, the name Melchizedek in Genesis 14. Genesis 14:18 says that Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was priest of El Elyon. Here in Genesis 14, just as in Psalm 110, Melchizedek is written as two words, joined by a makaph. And here in Genesis 14, there's no doubt that Melchizedek is a proper noun, either the personal name or more likely the title of the king of Salem. And the similarities between Melchizedek in Genesis 14 and Melchizedek in Psalm 110 are not just limited to the way in which the words appear on the page. There are also striking similarities in content between Genesis 14 and Psalm 110. For example, Melchizedek in Genesis 14 is both a king and a priest in Salem, or Jerusalem, just like the king in Psalm 110. And just as the appearance of Melchizedek in Genesis 14 occurs in the context of a battle against wicked kings that takes place over a broad stretch of land, so Psalm 110, right after it mentions Melchizedek, describes a battle against wicked kings across the wide world. And so the parallels between Psalm 110 and Genesis 14 make it very likely that Melchizedek in Psalm 110 is a proper noun, Melchizedek, a reference to the priest-king mentioned in Genesis 14. Another part of this issue in this verse has to do with the phrase al divrati, and this part of the issue is a bit more difficult. The phrase here in Psalm 110 is usually translated as after the manner of, or according to the order of. This translation assumes that divrati is in construct with Melchizedek, the order or manner of Melchizedek. This is how most modern translations and Hebrew grammars interpret this line. It's also how the ancient versions interpreted this line. A potential problem with this view, however, is the yod suffix at the end of divrati. If divrati were in construct, then we would expect divrat, a construct form which occurs 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes and twice in the Aramaic portions of Daniel. By contrast, the form divrati never occurs as a construct form. The suffix on divrati looks instead like a first-person singular pronominal suffix, my word or my decree, or as the NRSV footnote has it, my edict. The same form, divrati, occurs in Job 5:8, where it's clearly a noun with a pronominal suffix. Job says, I will lay my cause, divrati, before him. It's possible, however, that the suffix on divrati is what some grammarians call a connecting suffix, which occurs sometimes in poetic texts. In the poem in Genesis 49, for example, Judah is described as one who binds his donkey to the vine, osri la gefeniro, and in the next line as one who binds his colt, bani etono, to the choice vine. The yod suffixes at the end of osri and bani are examples of this connecting suffix. In the latter case, bani atono, the suffix is functioning to connect two nouns in construct, the son or colt of bani, his donkey. Interestingly, this same connecting yod occurs also in the name Melchizedek, a name which means king of Malchi, righteousness. It's possible that the psalmist chose to use a connecting yod in divrati to match or to play on the connecting yod in Melchizedek. We see, for example, in Genesis 49:11 that these connecting yods tend to cluster together. If then we interpret the yod in divrati as a connecting yod and not as a pronominal suffix, as the ancient versions seem to have interpreted it, then we can read divrati Melchizedek as a construct chain, governed by the preposition al. What then would be the meaning of this phrase? Well, sometimes the similar phrases al divrat and al davar mean concerning X or in relation to X. So we might interpret the phrase here to say in relation to Melchizedek. Al divrati points to a relationship, which in this context is probably a comparison, compared to Melchizedek or like Melchizedek. This interpretation makes good sense in the context of the psalm. In verse 4, the king is called a priest, and in this sense, he is like Melchizedek, who was also a priest and a king who reigned in Zion. In conclusion, then, we've translated the last line in verse 4 as just like Melchizedek, and we give this interpretation a B rating. The third issue in Psalm 110 is found in the next three verses, verses 5, 6, and 7. In these verses, there are 6 verbs: smashed, he will rule, he filled, he smashed, he will drink, he will lift. And for each of these verbs, the subject is disputed. It's not clear in each case whether the subject is the Lord or the king. We'll look first at the subject of the verbs in verses 5 to 6, then we'll look at the subject of the verbs in verse 7. In verses 5 to 6, the subject is probably the Lord, and there are 3 main arguments for this view. First, the Lord is explicitly named as the subject in verse 5. The name Adonai, as it was vocalized by the Masoretes and understood by all the ancient versions, refers to the Lord, and not to the king. All of these ancient traditions also understood Adonai in verse 5 to be the subject of this first clause. And if the Lord is the subject of this first clause, and if there's no indication of a subject change, then it's likely that the Lord is the subject of the following clauses as well, at least through the end of verse 6. Now, some have argued that Adonai, though it does refer to the Lord, is actually a vocative and not the subject. The NET, for example, says, O Lord, at your right hand, he, that is the king, strikes down kings in the day he unleashes his anger. According to this view, where Adonai is read as a vocative, the subject of the following verbs is the king. This view, however, goes against the unified tradition of the ancient versions and the Masoretic accents, all of which imply that Adonai is not a vocative, but the subject. The second argument for seeing the Lord as the subject in verses 5 to 6 is that back in verse 1, the Lord promised to subdue the king's enemies. Now here in verses 5 and 6, the subject of these verbs is subduing the king's enemies. It makes sense then, in light of verse 1, to see the Lord as the subject of these verbs, doing exactly what he promised to do in verse 1. The third argument for this view is that all of the verbs in verses 5 to 6 are third person. And up to this point in the psalm, the Lord has consistently been referred to in the third person, while the king, the addressee of the psalm, has been referred to in the second person. While it's true that person shifting from second person to third person is common in Hebrew poetry, so that it would be possible for the king to suddenly appear as the third person subject in verses 5 and 6, there's no indication of a person shift here. There's no reason to think that the Lord, who has been third person throughout the psalm, who is mentioned as the third person subject in verse 5, is not also the subject of the third person's verbs in verses 5 and 6. Now, the subject of verse 7 is a little more difficult to determine. If the Lord is the subject in verses 5 and 6, then, unless otherwise indicated, it makes sense to see him as the subject of these third person verbs in verse 7 as well. The problem with this view, at least what most commentators identify as the problem with this view, is that it's difficult to imagine the Lord drinking from a wadi. It's easier to imagine a human king as the subject of these verbs. And so the view of many commentators is that while the Lord is the subject of verses 5 and 6, in verse 7 there's a shift, and the king becomes the subject. This shift is necessitated by the image of drinking from a wadi, an image that can only apply to a human. Now, while it's true that the Lord is not elsewhere depicted as drinking, he is elsewhere depicted in terms of a human warrior. The Song of the Sea, for example, describes the Lord as a warrior, and Psalm 78 compares him to a warrior waking up from the stupor of wine. The image of the Lord drinking from the wadi in Psalm 110 is no less stark than the image of him waking from the stupor of wine in Psalm 78. And so the image of drinking in Psalm 110 verse 7 doesn't seem like a sufficient reason to posit an otherwise unindicated shift in subject between verses 5 and 6 and verse 7. Another reason for not seeing a subject shift between verses 5 to 6 and verse 7 is that these verses together give a unified picture of a warrior slaying his enemies and then refreshing himself after the battle. We see in Judges 15, for example, a picture of Samson killing 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey and then refreshing himself with a drink. It seems likely that in Psalm 110, the same one who fought, in verses 5 to 6, would be the same one to drink, in verse 7. In conclusion, then, it seems likely that the Lord is the subject throughout verses 5, 6, and 7. In these verses, he is depicted as a warrior, subduing the king's enemies, just like he promised to do in verse 1. We give this view a B rating, though we do admit that there is some ambiguity. And in our Poetic Features video for Psalm 110, we explore whether this ambiguity might be intentional on the part of the poet. So check out our Poetic Features video for more on this issue. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. In the first half of the psalm, verses 1 to 3, the Lord promises to subdue the king's enemies for him. In verse 1, he promises to make his enemies his footstool, and in verse 2, he promises to extend his dominion from Zion, and all of this implies military conquest. And so the first half of the psalm concludes with a description of the king's army. His people will be eager to fight for him. They will flock to his cause in massive numbers early in the morning as a sign of their willingness. They'll be like dew. They'll cover the mountains. There will be too many to count. And like dew, which ultimately comes from heaven, they will be a gift from heaven, a gift from God, given to the king. Before bringing us to the battle itself, the second half of the psalm, verses 4 to 7, opens by confirming the king's priestly status with an oath. The Lord swears that the king is a priest forever. As a king and priest in Jerusalem, he is like Melchizedek. The mention of Melchizedek then makes us think of Genesis 14 and the battle against the wicked kings described in that chapter, and this brings us to the last 3 verses of Psalm 110. These verses describe the battle against the king's enemies, and it describes it in highly theological terms. While it may be that the actual events behind this section envisage the king himself leading his army into battle, the psalm describes these earthly events in heavenly or theological terms. It's the Lord who's at the king's right side who fights for the king. It's the Lord who smashes heads and piles up corpses, who drinks from the wadi and raises his head in victory. In other words, it's the Lord who makes the king's enemies his footstool. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 110, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our Poetic Features video explores the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more.